father, but with the project engineers and administrators and guests during those 3 years when I was on the project. During several of those social functions, most of them in Albuquerque, there were discussions about things that they knew were going to take place in the future. And actually, let me just, before I get into 9/11, let me just mention what I remember being discussed. 9/11 was clearly discussed. The Clinton presidency was referenced several times. They knew that this young man named Bill Clinton was going to be elected president and that he was going to have 2 terms that were going to be very successful. And we now know that Bill Clinton was essentially the most successful American president of the 20th century. He was the only president since FDR, for example, to leave a surplus when he left office. So they knew about this generational change agent president named President Bill Clinton. There was also a reference to the advent of a disease that when people had sexual intercourse, they could spread a fatal disease to each other. And that wasn't referenced as AIDS, but they were clearly talking about AIDS but didn't know what it was being called. Or at least when they engaged in the shop talk, when they had read about it in one of the intelligence reports, they wouldn't be talking about what they read, which was acquired immune deficiency syndrome. They would just be telling somebody, yeah, I read in one of the reports that there's going to be this venereal disease that can kill you. Okay, it was sort of like that. And there was also a reference to the advent of the Internet. In fact, there was a discussion between John McCone of the CIA. Now, John McCone had worked with Ralph M. Parsons as essentially lieutenants to Stephen Bechtel during World War II, when Bechtel took, I think it was $100,000 and parlayed it into a $50 million fortune, building Liberty ships for the U.S. Navy during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Well, John McCone went into a career with the CIA, and it was the CIA that Project Pegasus was gathering intelligence about past and future events for. And then Ralph M. Parsons, of course, was my father's employer. In fact, I met Ralph Parsons at his office in New York during one of the trips with my dad when we were back, when Parsons was still on Wall Street in New York City, and my dad and I were back in New York on a project basis when I should have been in school, but I was actually out in New Jersey, but I was actually out in downtown New York with my father. I remember one visit to Ralph M. Parsons' personal office there at the Ralph M. Parsons Company. So there was a discussion with John McCone and my father and several other project engineers, and he was describing what the Internet would be. He was saying, well, let me describe it. Basically, the individual sitting at this device that looks like a synthesis of a television screen and a typewriter, and through that device, through a cable that runs from that device to an electrical grid or whatever, they can communicate with written messages with anybody wherever they are in the world.
Mm.
And my father really couldn't grasp what he was describing, and he got up from the table. And this is actually going to be one of the sort of comedic scenes in the feature film about my experiences. My dad said, "Yeah, I know, but I'm still disturbed by this phrase .com. Maybe it means the commies have taken over by then."
That's a good one, yeah.
I think that kind of describes the fact these were ordinary Americans. Some of them, obviously, just ordinary engineers working for a defense contractor like my dad. Some of them were obviously luminaries of their time in the intelligence community or in science, in quantum physics. But they were still human beings like us who were reading intelligence reports in which past and future events were being described, and they were just trying to synthesize that information with their existing worldview. So they didn't have this omniscient grasp of everything that was going to happen in the future. In fact, they had technicians sitting in these facilities essentially compiling information that they couldn't even analyze about, for example, past events. For example, when we went to that National Security Watch Post in Flemington, New Jersey, where I was shown about an 8-inch circular screen that was depicting actual images of Washington and Franklin at the signing of the U.S. Constitution in Philadelphia on September 17th of 1787, the technicians there were compiling 16-millimeter film, basically documentary film footage, of all of the hologram emissions that were being propagated and just storing it in film canisters. And so it was in that context that Project Pegasus was mapping the future. It was clearly an incomplete mapping because the only thing about the past or future that was notable that somebody like my father would have known as a result of reading the intelligence reports were the key points in those reports. There were things that they were recording, for example, with the chronovisors that probably intelligence analysts never even analyzed.
So
it was really just collected. And
do you think that, just to interject there, do you think that primarily then just was because of the fact that the military was just interested in a certain type of information related to, I don't know, internal security or what's going to happen in the future, so we can prevent it from happening? So it's run like a military program for other purposes than we might think of it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I know based on based on the educational curriculum that we received in the program, namely the training we received, and certainly this was also reiterated by the project engineers on a social level when I was in their company, for example, in Albuquerque. There had been a decision, both an executive decision and then also there was a consensus on the project, that the project should be used to gather intelligence to allow the federal government of the United States to engage in contingency planning regarding future events, but not play God and try to divert the course of human destiny.
Right.
So they clearly had specific intelligence objectives. For example, during that probe to the future to 2013 that we undertook when we had to wear the protective clothing at ITT Defense, and we literally, according to my father, we literally disappeared from the stage when they turned the light on. He thought we had been destroyed. He thought we had been obliterated by the light. He had to go into another room and compose himself. And when we reappeared and I was walked off the stage so I could be debriefed by a naval intelligence officer, my dad had tears in his eyes. He'd been crying because he thought we had been killed. Okay, so in that case, they had a specific target, which is what is going to be the condition of the U.S. Supreme Court building in 2013. Okay, and that's where we saw the Supreme Court building under about 100 feet of brackish water. Okay, so some involve specific intelligence objectives, yes, but my point is that when they were using these different forms of quantum access, for example, when they were propagating holograms in New Jersey and having these dour technicians in white lab coats film everything, that stuff was just being thrown in canisters. I don't know how extensive the analysis of that data was. Similarly, when we were retrieving microfilm summaries of future events, when we were jumping through the Stargate at Cerrillos and arriving there at that office building in the year 2045, and going inside and being given small little canisters of microfilm, and then ferrying them back through a teleport there, popping back into view in 1972 in the grounds immediately around the microwave tower at the Lobo Overlook site in southwestern Colorado, which is due west of the Continental Divide sign there on Highway 160. We were bringing a substantial amount of data back, and I don't know whether intelligence analysts were going over every frame of that. So that's kind of the backdrop for describing what I actually saw of 9/11. I think that creates the context of what I'm saying. They were gathering a lot of data about the past and future, and I'm not certain whether they were actually identifying discrete data points when they were just doing sort of this gross harvesting of data. Clearly, some specific intelligence objectives where they wanted an answer to one question, like what's the condition of the U.S. Capitol, in 2013.
Right.
But at other times it seemed that they were just gathering data. Presumably it's been analyzed by now. So what happened was we were at the La Hacienda restaurant. My dad had a personal friend there that off and on, it seems, in his life he had been romantically involved with. He clearly had been romantically involved with Connie Chavez when he first went out to New Mexico in 1953-54 for Curtiss Wright to flight test the ramjet engine. And those activities were undertaken clearly in the post-July 1952, extraterrestrial defense posture, right? Because it was in October of 1952, after that famous overflight of Washington, D.C., by 9 flying saucers clocked at traveling at over 7,000 miles per hour by the air traffic control at the Langley Air Force Base, that my father was literally given military orders to report to Curtiss Wright to work on the ramjet. So when they were then flight testing the ramjet, when they had it built by 1953-54, he met this beautiful Spanish-American waitress named Mary Constance Chavez, who was a native Albuquerque, in fact, lived in Albuquerque her whole life, dying there in January of 1981 at age 52. Okay, so I was describing the fact that, Connie Chavez was this love interest in my dad's life, and that went back 20 years before I was even on Project Pegasus as a kid, or almost 20 years.